The kind of landscape that Aborigines created in 1788 and earlier, before Europeans came, was distributed in patterns. The plants were distributed in patterns so that there was trees next to grass and grass broken up by clumps of trees, forest broken up by clearings and so on. If you like, a mosaic of different kinds of plant communities, and that was true whether it was rainforest or spinifex or whatever. I suppose the most notable feature of those patterns was that there was a lot of grass. Grass was clearly favoured by Aboriginal people, and I suppose for obvious reasons. Grassland carried so much food, not only the grasses but bulbs and tubers, yams and so on, and also grass is what the biggest animals that they hunted ate, so kangaroos and so on. In other words, most meat was on grass, so Aboriginal people made a lot of grass out of forest and out of scrub by burning those back and so on. But of course, grass eaters need shelter as well as feed, and so Aboriginal people would put open forest next to grass for kangaroos, perhaps dense forest next to grass for brush wallabies. It depended on the animal and it depended on the plant, but basically they're associating food and shelter, and it was those that made this mosaic pattern that I described as dominating the Australian countryside. When Europeans first came to Australia, and for a long while since, you might as well say right up until now, they assumed that what they saw was natural. They often described the landscape as parks. Park was probably the most common word that Europeans used after the word bush. And of course a park is made. The parks they were thinking of were the gentlemen's parks in England, where you have grass and forest and so on. But it never occurred to them that the parks could have been made in Australia. It didn't occur to them that wandering savages could have done such a thing. So their common assumption was they were seeing a natural landscape, but an extraordinarily useful landscape for grazing animals like sheep and cattle. And so Australia is going to be a sheep walk forever. Because why it was so useful for grazing animals is because Aborigines had made it for grazing animals. People have an image of a dense bushland as what characterised a lot of Australia, say early in the 19th century. And it's true that the land selectors had a very tough job clearing very dense timber. But if you look at the contemporary paintings depicting that, you can see a lot of that dense bush grew up before land selection came in the mid-19th century or a bit later. In other words, they were working on country that had already started to recover from the burning that Aboriginal people made. Trees were already capturing grass. On the other hand, it's true there was some dense forest, and it was confined by burning grass around it, for the very good reason that there are a lot of animals who want dense forests. That's where they live, and so it's habitat, so Aboriginal people manage that habitat for them. So you can get every conceivable kind of habitat: swamps, mangroves, dense forest, woodland, grassland, distributed in patterns all over Australia. There were two ways in which Aboriginal people created this mosaic-like landscape. One was water. They'd block river flows or in very dry country dam streams to provide water for themselves and for animals, of course. And there's some quite striking examples of big dams, 150-yard dams, 5 foot high in dry country to hold water. But far and away the most important was fire. We think of fire as an enemy, as something to be fearful of, and the way we treat it is not surprising that we think that way. For Aboriginal people it was a totem and it was an ally, and they learnt to work with it. They had ceremonies for it, so they would speak to it beforehand and ask it to cooperate, and so on, and then they had very intense knowledge of how to use it. They could predict where it would go, when it would burn out, how long it would burn for, how hot, and they would adjust their timing and their placement of the fire to allow for all those variables, and in that way keep the forest back to make grass, open dense forest into open woodland, make all those patterns that were necessary for one or other animal, and at the same time as providing the necessities for them, they could predict where those animals were going to be, because there were only particular places that suited those animals, and the animals of course would go to those places. So fire, far and away, is the closest ally for managing land. I think there are some great benefits, great advantages that Aboriginal people got from this system. It made them a free people. By that I mean that a countryside of parks, which Europe brought to mind, the parks in Europe to the newcomers, is really a countryside for a lesser gentry, isn't it? In England, it's the gentry, the aristocracy, who have the parks and who use them for leisure and recreation. Aboriginal people are making the same sort of landscape, and so it would be best to think of them as a free gentry, if you like. Of course, they had to work hard to make that landscape. Fire's constant companion. They have to work with it all the time. And of course, they also had to work hard to perform the ceremonies which were absolutely necessary to persuade fire, to reassure animals that where fire was going to come. Those ceremonies will work, and just as important as the actual ecological management. But even given that, it's quite clear that Aboriginal people had a lot of time for recreation. Europeans used to complain about them sitting around in the middle of the day talking or dancing and singing their corroborees. They said they were constantly at corroborees, they were constantly just sitting around yarning. They're very lazy people for doing that. But of course, only people who know that they can get their food and their shelter easily have got the recreation time to do things like sit around and talk in the middle of the day and corroborees. Europeans can't do it. They've got to work 8 hours a day, but Aboriginal people could do it. And that's why I say it made them a free people. It's an interesting question, I suppose, why someone would get interested in this. In my case, I worked on farms, and I got to know Narrandera area in the Riverina quite well. And then I was asked to write a history of Narrandera Shire, and I read some of the early records of newcomers describing grassland, rich grassland, up to the horses' withers and so on, in the Narrandera area. And I knew that those areas were now forest. And that raised the question, if it's forest now, why wasn't it forest then? It couldn't be bushfire. If you burn eucalypts, as we see outside every capital city, if you burn eucalypts, they just resprout from the trunk and from the branches. They don't disappear. But clearly from these areas they had disappeared. How could it be? And the answer, after a lot of trial and error, the only answer I could come up with was repeated and careful and very precise fire which burnt off the seedlings and the saplings and left the grassland. There's only one way that could happen, and that was for Aboriginal people. And that set me thinking about, okay, why were they doing it? How are they doing it? And gradually I could see the patterns building up and the diversity of their management becoming more and more skillful and diverse and so on. My research used 3 kinds of source. The first, being a historian, the first was the records of people who wrote, almost always Europeans, about the land before any European had had a chance to change it. So explorers, very early settlers and the like. The second source, particularly in the north, was anthropological. looking at Aboriginal people burning country, reading detailed accounts by anthropologists about how they went about it, and by ecologists describing what effect this would have on plants and animals. And then the third source was the plants themselves. It's quite striking. About 70% of Australian plants tolerate or need fire. And that means in early paintings or in early descriptions of landscape, you can see the effects of fire. If somebody says, for example, there's a whole forest of young wattles, you know that came about because somebody had burnt the country. So in those early records, knowing how plants respond to fire told you where fire had been and who had put it there. We can learn several things, I think, from how Aboriginal people manage the country. The most obvious now, and probably the most pressing, is fire. Every capital city virtually in the last decade or so has had a terrible fire which has burnt suburbs, killed people. The most recent, February 2009, just outside Melbourne. Absolutely terrible. If Aboriginal people had suffered those fires, it's hard to imagine that they could have survived them. But clearly they did, and therefore they didn't have those fires. So how did they do it? I think the first thing is fuel control. Fuel control is the key to fire control. If there was fuel, they would burn it. How they did that depended on where they were in Australia, but for example in southern Australia, they would be burning in winter. Perhaps only a very small patch because the ground's wet and the grass is green and so on. But as the country dried, they could burn bigger and bigger patches, and that created a mosaic of burnt and unburnt patches, which they then put a big fire through, but always under control, because when it hit the unburnt patches, the fire would be slowed down or stopped. So they're suppressing fuel. That's critical, and it's one of the proofs, I think, that Aboriginal people manage virtually everywhere. There's nowhere where the fuel built up so that it became devastating. The nearest would be the ash forest, the mountain ash forest, which are highly flammable but burn not often. But even in there, Aboriginal people would burn clearings and so on while the forest was young, and in that way control the fires within them. That's the first lesson we could learn. I think also we could learn more about biodiversity. Since Europeans came, I don't know how many species of plants and animals have become extinct, but a great many. Australia is a world leader in extinguishing plants and animals. They survived Aboriginal management, and therefore we could learn how did Aboriginal people keep them alive where we can't. And the third thing is the Aboriginal management system needed plenty of land. If you're going to burn out an area, you've got to have somewhere else to go. If you're going to leave an area alone so that animals can recover from being hunted, you've got to keep clear of it, otherwise they'll always be frightened. That means you've got to have plenty of land. That means you've got to limit population. And Aboriginal people clearly had many mechanisms to limit population. Sooner or later, I think we're going to have to do that too. Can we ever go back to 1788? No. We've got to learn some rules, so fire, as I say, but Europeans are too many, too arrogant, too comfortable, too complacent, too successful to ever imagine of reverting to a pre-farming existence such as Aboriginal people had. We're going to have to make the best compromise we can with our European past, which is our European present. We're still basically Europeans, and the lessons that Aboriginal people could teach us about how to manage what for us is still a foreign country.